Just think, it's shorter than you think. No think. Longing is the music of our sphere. The gift of life is never more or less. It starts at any time you like and ends in just a wink. Pass me the lighter, baby.
Pomare, whakarofo lahi atu, welcome to the Daily Examiner. My name is Elliot Ikilei. It is a distinct pleasure and honour to greet you here tonight. I want to quickly get into our strong discussion, so let me bring in my co-host. This is Mel Taylor. Mel Taylor, good evening, how are you?
Good evening, I'm good. I'm looking forward to doing an interview with these awesome people tonight.
Oh, wicked. So, just as before we get stuck into this, as we do on our events and on our episodes, if you want to be part of the discussion, absolutely throw in a question in there. We will do our best to bring it out into our topics, and we will do our best to be able to speak to our guests. They are very busy, very important people that we have. We are really grateful to have them on board. Just to give you a real brief account as to what has been happening, what's happened is that a group of 15 churches, mosques, even an Anglican priest, my understanding is, have been going to court to take on Ashley Bloomfield as well as Minister Chris Hipkins in order to have a judicial review on how the government mandated the discriminatory practices. Now, I don't want to get into it too much because I want to ask these guys exactly what it is that's happened and what's going on forward. So, again, just for some housekeeping, thank you so much for all of you who have donated to the page and allowed us the strength to keep fighting and to bringing you the truth as to what's happening. We do appreciate it. We absolutely thank you so much for everything on that. And without further ado, we want to bring in the wonderful lawyers, Madeline Flanagan. Madeline, how are you?
Hi, good evening. I'm good. And you?
Oh, good. Hungry, but I always eat after these things, so awesome. And of course, we've got the wonderful Graham Edgler. Graham, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Now, just to let you know, Graham is someone who I didn't realise until I was reminded of it, that he is someone who gets caught up quite often, especially by ZB, to talk on certain cases or at least issues and understandings of legal and law terms. And it's really great to have him on board. Madeline is someone who has had a great deal of work, and I believe, especially in the family court, is that correct, Madeline?
Yes, I've done quite a lot of family court work.
Oh, painful. I'm sure. Wow.
Very,
I mean,
very
from my
painful.
angle.
Yeah.
No, awesome. Look, and I don't want to take away. Would you mind giving yourselves just letting our audience know who you are and just a real brief bio as to sort of your position in the society that we have currently? Sounds a bit morbid, but yeah. Let's have a start with Madeline, eh?
Okay. So I am a barrister based in Orewa, North Auckland. I own Hibiscus Coast Legal Chambers. I'm a mum of 4. I have 2 horses. I've got a background primarily in family law until this, but always had an interest in rights and freedoms law, and particularly public law. You know, the sort of, is the government getting it right? Are the decisions being made for New Zealanders right? Always had that interest, and so within family law, there's been a lot of opportunity to work in those areas. And sort of more recently, I've been working in other areas.
Wow.
Awesome as Graham, what about yourself?
I'm a barrister as well. I work down in Wellington, so it was not very far for me to go to the Wellington High Court for this case. I do a lot of rights-based cases, freedom of speech type things, also election law. So if people have heard me on ZB or maybe on Radio New Zealand or something like that, it's often talking about, is this candidate breaking the law or something like that, or donation scandals or things like that I often get called up to speak about, but about a lot of other constitutional law type issues and public law type issues as well. Questions like a lot of my cases and most of my work is someone has been affected by a government decision. Potentially it's affected one of their Bill of Rights, and we're the ones either challenging that decision or objecting to what the government is doing. And so this was a new area for me slightly. I hadn't done a religion case before, but there aren't many of them, but it was sort of the type of case I do, but just in a slightly different area, a different section of the Bill of Rights Act, rather than like section 22 or 23, section 15.
Awesome. Oh, wicked. Now, I want to ask straight off the bat, we know a lot of our people have been asking and they've been contacting us saying, hey, is this free to be church sort of scenario? And we've said, no, this is actually something different. This was started before. Would you, Madeline, could you take us through what is it that you have just finished fighting, and I'm going to use the word fighting and battling the government over. So could you tell us what the specifics of it are?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess going back to you mentioned Free to Be Church. In about the middle of last year, I had some conversations with Free to Be Church and a whole lot of other people as well. There were a lot of people concerned, I guess, at some of the ways the government had made rules during the middle of the pandemic and how they had impacted on people who profess faith. There are a lot of, obviously, we all had opinions about lockdowns and the things we could and couldn't do, and if they were consistent, and there were heaps of those kinds of conversations. But there was definitely a thread of conversation running with religious organisations, particularly in Auckland, I think, because we had just so many lockdowns. It was quite a rough year that last year, and Yeah, and so there were a whole lot of conversations, and there were meetings and things like that online where people were getting together and talking with lawyers and groups in other countries who had issued challenges. And there was talk about, could one come here? And to begin with, I was kind of like, that sounds like a great idea, but don't ask me to do it. It's not me. I can't do it. Someone else should do it. I'd like to help. I'd like to watch, but I don't know. There's probably half a dozen biblical characters that could spring to mind of people going, yeah, send someone else. Not me. But it ended up being this sort of what came down to it, and how our case came about was a meeting was called in December last year when the traffic light laws were announced, around December, where we talked about the specifics of what we knew about those laws and what was coming. And we just floated, like, would anyone be interested in doing a case? And I just couldn't get over the number of people who signed on, the number of churches that signed on, mosques. And basically, I forgot what your question was now, but basically the challenge was to how those lines were drawn. Everyone, and I want to be really clear about this to everyone who's watching, this is not an anti-vax case. This is not a COVID denying case. This is not a group of religious people who think you can pray the COVID away, or that it's just a flu, or, it's none of that stuff. This is people who get that COVID is serious, who get that people are really worried about it, who get that, it's a threat and that government has to do something about it, that we as a society have to do something about it. And who are, I think just about everyone, no, not just about everyone, every single church group, mosque group, individual involved in the case, the leaderships of all those churches are heavily vaxxed, and their congregations are as well. They're not any different to the stats you hear for New Zealand. The same is true of them. So it isn't that, and I'm not knocking people who aren't vaccinated or who are, have a different view. I think, in a free and democratic society, everyone has to make their own decisions about their health care. But I'm just saying that, a lot of shade likes to be thrown at people who make the wrong medical decisions, and you can't throw that shade at my clients.
Nicely said. So, Graham, with you in there, what was the crux? What was the contention that was going on? What was it? Now, my understanding is Dr. Ashley Bloomfield and Minister Chris Hipkins was a part of this. What were the angles of the question or the challenge itself?
So it's, again, this isn't a challenge. There's a reason this challenge was brought in December and not right at the start of the pandemic. I mean, right at the start of the pandemic, everything was closed, and you could see the justification for it. But as you get on further and further through the pandemic, and things like once we know masking, we've got masking available, and once, testing, rapid antigen testing and things like that become available, and particularly once the vaccine becomes available, that things are slightly less dangerous now than they were then, because New Zealand is highly vaccinated and because these churches are highly vaccinated. So it was the start of the pandemic, schools were closed. Lockdown, level 4, level 3, schools and churches were both closed. Come December, we've got COVID vaccination certificates. Places are allowed to open now, 25 people or 100 people if you've got vaccination certificates. But there's a difference, for example, for schools or for Air New Zealand. Air New Zealand was allowed to say, yep, you can come on here even if you don't have a COVID vaccination certificate. Schools were allowed to say, schools were banned from asking for COVID vaccination certificates from pupils and even parents who might want to come along, because education, the government realised, is education is really important. So we shouldn't be requiring people to have COVID vaccination certificates to go to schools or even to universities, or even to have their parents come along, because it's so important. But the government just didn't think that religion was that important. And your religions are right in the Bill of Rights Act, just the way that right to an education in the Education Act. And now that we've got vaccinations, now that we know masking is very helpful to avoid, COVID getting widespread or super spreader events and things like that. Now that we've got all of those things, is the decision at this point to tell churches, you have to ask for COVID vaccination certificates. Otherwise, you can't really meet, and as the one body of Christ, or mosques. You can't have your daily prayers, or particularly your Friday prayer meeting, unless you're limited to 25 people. When schools were allowed to have 25 people or more per classroom, whether they were vaccinated or not. And so it was a challenge at that point, because governments are allowed to infringe on people's rights if they've got a good reason to do it. And one of the ways of checking whether they've got a good reason to do it is there something they could have done less restrictive and still attained their goal? And our strong argument was basically, COVID is a big problem. But now that we've got vaccinations and masks and tests, now that we're at this stage in the pandemic, telling churches you have to turn away people at the door. You can't, you have to deny people, access to the word of God if you want to meet together. We thought that was a step too far, because the government had other options. It could have applied the same rules that applied to Air New Zealand to churches, and this case wouldn't have happened. It could have applied the same rules that applied to schools to churches, and this case wouldn't have happened. But it said, no, churches, you're like social clubs. Religion isn't any different from sport or going to the library or going to a store or something like that. It's something people do, and it's nice for people who are involved. But churches, they're not special or important in the way that going to school is. And we looked at the case and thought, no, that's not a good enough reason. And so the churches and mosques we represent, they felt the same way. They didn't issue a challenge during the first lockdown when everyone was closed, because there weren't other options. No one was vaccinated. People were getting sick, and people would have died. And many people have. But when we got to the position we're at now, it's, government, you do have some other options. And you've got some other options because you're exercising them for areas you've decided are important. Education, or, public transport, or even domestic transport, getting on a plane. And so now that you recognize you can operate those bits of society safely, if you take, wash your hands, wear masks, don't be stupid about things, then if you can operate those safely, churches who are willing to shut down during lockdowns were saying, well, why can't we have the same option? And so we looked at the law and said, the decision made by Minister Chris Hitkins to require CVCs in churches in the same way CVCs were required in community groups or other organizations like that, or restaurants, once we got to Orange and things like that. Once that's what you're doing, no, churches are different. The right to manifest or the right to practice your religion with others is different, and it's important in a way that the government really didn't seem to recognize. And so, and the law does recognize, is our argument. So we asked a judge, look, the Bill of Rights Act says the right to manifest your religion is important. It's one of the civil and political rights we have, and there's only 20 or 30 sections in the Bill of Rights Act of these are the important rights. Religion, right to have a religion is one, right to practice your religion is another. And we said there can be limits, but the limits that the government imposes on the right to religion, the right to manifest your religion, they have to be reasonable limits. And now that we're at this stage in the pandemic, with things like highly vaccinated churches, with things like masking, we think you've gone slightly too far this time, because you've recognized that other options are available and you've applied them, for example, to schools. And so it was, we just sort of wanted equality for churches in the same way that applied it to schools. We wrote to the minister, we wrote to Dr. Ashley Bloomfield and said, this is our proposal. Here are how some churches are doing it overseas, very detailed things of, for example, Catholic churches who agreed, we're not going to have the Eucharist, the placing of the wafer on the tongue as part of, the Lord's Supper. There are limits that they're willing to do, but they wanted to be able to meet together in the way they should and could, and they thought could safely, and the government agreed schools could. And so why not apply it to them and give them the same rights that you've given secular organizations like the schools?
And just following on from that, I mean, Christianity for a lot of people, it isn't just a small event. It's an entire lifestyle for a lot of people. They live it every day, and wanting to get with other people like that and go to a place of worship is really, really important to them. It's not just a couple of hours on a Sunday type event anyway. It's their whole lifestyle. And my understanding is that there were 15 applicants and 2 mosques, but those 15 applicants were on behalf of 110 churches. Is that right?
It was 113 churches and mosques plus 1 Anglican minister. So when the 15 applicants were like they were, you might have like a denomination that has, I don't know, 15 other churches or something like that. So so when you broke it down to on a Sunday / a Friday, depending on whether you're at a mosque or each week, there were 113 locations that our clients were conducting services at. And so they were representing, they were serving 27,000 New Zealanders. And that was simply who signed on after our 1 video call. So we put the word out and said, look, we're thinking about a case. Well, not we, but me and our primary client put the case out that they were thinking about a case, sent out an invite, and that's how many signed up after 1 video session. So
is there any law in the past that you've got to go by? Because COVID's a totally new thing, and you've got overseas cases that obviously you can call on to say what's happened there. But has there been anything in the past that you've had to go by as far as New Zealand and religion?
No, not in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, this is completely new. In the history of our country, I couldn't find a single example of a religious organisation, whether it's a church, a mosque, or some other faith, suing the government. Certainly not since the Bill of Rights Act was passed in 1990. There's been a small handful of religious freedom cases, but they've usually been an individual who's had some sort of less than mainstream religious views and they felt infringed, so they brought a case, but nothing like this. And even overseas, so in response to the pandemic, an Austrian law, I guess it's an Austrian legal organisation who's been tracking all these sort of religious cases against sort of COVID laws. The guy running that put a chart together, and he tracked something like 17 cases around the world, and I think 9 of them had been heard at the time, last time I looked at it, or 11 of them had been heard and 9 of them had been successful in other countries. And of course we were numbers 16 and 17, I think, on this chart. But what was really interesting was, of these cases around the world, most of the applicants have been individuals, or they've been like 1 church. I think the most churches involved in any one case outside of New Zealand was 3. So for us to have, our 112 plus our Anglican minister, and then Free to Be Church, who were heard with us, had something like 65 plus ministers and churches as well. It takes the numbers to like 175, if I can math correctly. That's epic. And even in America, where you won't be surprised if I tell you there's been lots of churches and religious organizations suing people over, like in America. That's not new, but it is new for this many. Like even in America, these kind of numbers are staggering.
Wow, setting precedent around the world.
Yeah. I have to say, I think it's wonderful seeing that churches and Christians finally sort of gathering together to stand up for their rights. I also find it really cool that you've got you've got mosques sort of joining in as well. I think that's really cool. Really, really cool. Just to let you know, Leanne Ray has put up a comment here. She's asking, what did the government lawyers argue? And I'm quite curious. What did they argue? What was their sort of comeback for that?
Well, they had 2 prongs of argument. The first was to our challenge that the minister had actually failed to understand religion, because that was our first argument. I mean, he had clearly thought about it, and he had clearly thought that he was responding to it, and he clearly thought that the alternatives that he had offered in his order would meet the bill. But the big flaw in his assumption was his failure to actually understand the nature of religion. So they kept saying that they did understand it, and we said, no, you don't. And that was sort of one of the big sort of areas that we went, I guess, head to head with them on. And the other thing they argued was they kept saying that they were treating religious gatherings exactly the same as secular gatherings. And they were saying, look, you can't ask for special treatment. We're treating religious gatherings like secular gatherings, to which we said, no, you're not, because what you've done is you've defined gatherings. You've said all these times that people come together, in these instances, that's a gathering in terms of the legal definition, gathering in the order. But all these other examples, like schools, like being on planes, those aren't gatherings. Those are, well, they are gatherings, but they're not gatherings. They're gatherings in this camp, not in the camp. So we were sort of going, well, if you set the definition up so that you exclude a whole lot of situations where people come together, and then you say, well, we're not talking about these, and we're going to stick them over here, and then we're going to look at all the things we haven't ring fenced off, all the types of gatherings that are in this category that you're in, and look, we're all treating you equally, and we're going, yeah, but we shouldn't be in this group. We should be in the group. We should be in the group with the other rights protected activities. Yes. Not in the group of, I think, as Graham said, the nice to haves. Like your social activities and your sports groups. So those were sort of the key things. So we had to sort of, that anyway, to answer Leanne's question, that those were the two primary things that they were arguing. They were saying, look, we're treating religious gatherings equally, and look, we do understand religion's important, but then the examples they were giving demonstrated they didn't, or at least that they didn't understand. Not that they didn't understand religion is important, that they didn't understand the nature of religion. They were treating it a lot like, I think Graham talked about the letter that we wrote them at the start, particularly at the beginning, because the way they set the options up in the law. So they came in and they said, okay, we're going to have vaccine passes, and they're going to apply to churches and places of worship. Now you've got two options. So if you're a church or you're a mosque, you can say, okay, well, if everyone has a vaccine pass, 100 people can come in, and you can have 100 people in a room, provided there's enough space for 100 people to have some distance between them. And if you don't want to exclude people, if you don't want to say no to the person at the door who doesn't have a vaccine pass, you can let that person in, but you have to limit your numbers to 25. Now you can run multiple events. So like if you've got a nice big building, you can have one hall that's got 100 people in it and they've all got vaccine passes. And then you can have another hall, might be somewhere else in your building where you've got your 25 people in, but you've got to keep them all separate. And then they basically said, well, look, this way, Joe can wake up on Sunday morning or on Friday if he's Muslim, and he can get in his car and walk into the building and have his service and go home. He can either be in the 25-person room or the 100-person room. Box ticked. Joe's religious freedom has been satisfied. But of course, for Christians, that isn't satisfying worship at all, because for Christians, a church service is about the believers gathering together as one church. It is about coming together as one. So the right to religious freedom in our law is both an individual right and a collective right. And by that I mean I have a right to have religion if I want religion, but I'm also part of the church body, and the church, part of my right is coming together with the church body. So, and if you are in the leadership of a church, your job is to make sure that the church body is available to each person who wants to come in. So you've got this kind of right that belongs to the church, as in all the people in the church and the leadership of the church and the leaders of the church themselves too, because it's not just a job for them, it's a vocation. So they've got this right to ensure they're providing this group activity. And you've got the right of the group, plus you've also got the right of the individuals. And so the sort of consumer model of focusing only on the person, only on the individual, misses the point. And for the mosques, what we understand from them is that it's very important to them that they're able to access the mosque itself, the building. The building is very, very important. There's a tradition or a saying that each step that takes you closer to the mosque brings you closer to God. And so attending the mosque and having your prayers in the mosque is incredibly important. So yes, if you can't get near the mosque, praying wherever you can be is better than nothing. But you should still be, aiming to get back to the mosque as soon as you can. And of course, your 5 daily prayers have to be done at particular windows of time, ideally in a mosque. Your Friday congregational meeting is incredibly important in the mosque again. And the problem you've got, if you've got a small mosque, a small community mosque like the 2 mosques in our case, the leadership teams are small, the space is small. They don't have the option of having one room for the vaccinated, another room for the unvaccinated. They have to offer the daily prayers at set times. So it becomes a logistic problem. If you run, so you could say, oh, well, we'll run all the vaccinated ones first and then we'll run the non-vaccinated. Well, they can't. The windows of time lapse. They'd have to have bigger leadership teams. They'd have to have space. And they had a problem that some of the churches had as well, in that the landlords of the buildings they were using were imposing vaccine passports on everyone. So they actually couldn't even exercise the unvaccinated option. So, yeah.
Right, amazing. All right, so look, I think I asked this before in the green room, but I didn't quite, I don't know. So I don't know. So I'm hungry. All right, so I want to know what sort of happened. Graham, can you take us through? So what was the outcome? Now, my understanding is that it's all finished up today. What's the outcome? What do we know so far since it's finished?
We had 2 days of hearing last week. And so we had our case, and then Free Church had their case as well, and the Crown was responding to both. We got to the end, and the judge says, I'm going to have to think about this. And that's not terribly surprising. This is the first time a case like this has come up in New Zealand, and judges in this sort of case don't make decisions on the fly. If you come up before a district court judge and you want bail, they might make a decision right there. This type of case, the judge is going to have to think about it. We filed hundreds of pages of evidence from our claimants and from them. Free Church filed lots of evidence as well. We had a theologian provide evidence. We had a medical expert provide evidence about what the government was saying about what was really needed to be safe. And so the judge is going to have to think about all of that and decide, okay, go back and reread the important bits, or remember, I'm not sure of the answer to that, or someone said something about that. What was it they said? And then go and find their written affidavit, or look at our written submissions or the Crown's written submissions and say, okay, now what's the result? And so the judge did what is called reserved the decision, which is told us we're not sure when. Maybe it's a month, maybe it's 6 weeks, maybe it's 3 months. When I've made up my mind, I'm going to let you know, and they'll email us the judgment. And so if you've seen any of the other COVID-related cases, that we've had the recentish one, the slightly famous one of the challenging the online system to come into New Zealand, the grounded Kiwis case. People trying to come back to New Zealand who are told, no, you need to book limited numbers of quarantine facilities or isolation facilities, and there aren't enough for everyone who wants to come. That decision was heard quite a few months ago, and so they got a decision a little while ago, and then they've got a second decision, with the formal result of it sometime last week. And so these things can take time, and one of the reasons you haven't heard of the result is there isn't one yet, I'm afraid.
Oh man, that's a jip, man. I was hungry. For something. Hungry.
Are you confident?
Oh, no, but it does make sense. It does. I understand. Yeah, like you say, there's hundreds of documents out there. The judge does have to take time for it. But gutted. Yeah.
This isn't the type of case, I think, that if we'd got a decision that would have been in the news. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. No, exactly right. That's
Yes.
exactly right. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Look, and I've just been going through some of the comments in the area here. There's some good fights going on as well. As whenever we bring up Christianity and religion, there's always a few fights, which is also quite fascinating. Do you think, I know, this is conjecture. Do you think we could be looking at something that is similar in terms of how the government was found illegal in some of the ways they did their lockdowns, and also in terms of their mandating of the police and soldiers? Is this in that same realm that you think it might occur?
It's similar. I think probably the lockdown one is a little different. The legal arguments in that case, there were a lot of legal arguments in that case, and almost all of them lost. And so there was a challenge to the first lockdown. And the only bit that won was the first 2 weeks of lockdown for a sort of technical legal reason of the government just said we're locked down, and it hadn't actually passed any laws or hadn't gone through the process of doing it. And so that's one sort of challenge you can have. Another sort of challenge is the challenge, I'd say we're probably, the similarity we have, there's a bit of similarity to the police case and a bit of similarity to grounded Kiwis, because both of those cases are the judicial reviews, the sort of the legal process, but they are Bill of Rights related. And so the grounded Kiwis case was, if you're a New Zealand citizen, you've got a right to come to New Zealand. And sometimes that right can be stopped. If you're arrested for murder in Australia, you don't have a right to leave Australia and come in New Zealand. So that's a reasonable limit on your right to, as a New Zealand citizen, to leave a country and come into New Zealand. But the government, it's again like we have here, the government needs a good reason. And the decision it takes, and the decision it takes to stop you doing something, to exercising a Bill of Rights guaranteed right, the decision has to be a reasonable one. It has to have potentially a really good reason for it, because some rights are particularly important. And it has to have, is there something could we have done it better? Was there a less restrictive alternative? And so that case was dealing with the right of New Zealanders to return to New Zealand. Some of the vaccine mandate cases where particular employees were told you must be vaccinated, those are sort of right to refuse medical treatment. That's another right in the Bill of Rights. And so those sorts of cases, people can be forced to take medical treatment. But again, you need a really good reason. And the types of, forcing someone to take a vaccine in this case probably isn't good enough. Or at least usually won't be. There might be some really, really important jobs. You are a doctor working in a rest home, and you are going to be dealing with people who are 85 or 90, and they are at great risk. It's possibly reasonable to tell that person, you need to take the vaccine, or you can still be a doctor, but probably not work in a rest home. And so there will be a limited group of jobs like that where it's justifiable, but there will be many jobs where it's just, no, the types of safety features we have, you can go on and you can work in another area. There's, we won't send you on that one particular job or something like that. And so the cases like that, people have a right to refuse medical treatment. And so if the government is telling them in this particular case, you have to take it or lose your job, that's something that can be challenged. And again, you need a good reason, but it's a different type of reason. This is the first, big, case of this government has breached someone's religious rights, we say unjustifiably, to go to court. But there are a lot of other cases, and you'll know them over many years of governments, infringing people's freedom of speech or conducting illegal searches or things like that, other rights that are in the Bill of Rights. And so the types of questions courts ask, is this reasonable in a free and democratic society, is sort of where we get to at the end. The question the court is asking in a lot of these cases is, this is a restriction of the right. It's an important right that we recognize people should be allowed to exercise. Is why the government's doing it a good enough reason to restrict that right? At the start of the pandemic, closing all the churches and all the schools and everyone, the answer is almost certainly yes. 2 years almost in, or 2 years now probably in, the answer might not be yes. The answer we say is no. There was another alternative here. You could have restricted what churches do without banning them from doing things, or without requiring them to exclude people who want to hear God's message. And so that's sort of, it's a question that's asked for a lot of other rights. This is just the first time it's about the right to practice religion in New Zealand anyway.
Awesome. Well, look, I know that you guys are very busy. I know that you've got a lot of things that you need to get into. And also we know that we want to keep a real close eye on this. This goes at the heart of, in fact, a lot of our audience happen to be people of faith, those who do hold God to be very high. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of hard feelings that still need to be worked through within our church community. So we are really grateful that you've taken up this fight and this cause. We really are. Mel, do you have last things to say there?
Yeah, thank you guys. I think it is really important, and I think there's a lot of people that seem to think this is just about religion. It's actually about freedom. It's about the Bill of Rights, and I sort of wanted to say, is there anything else you want to add to that? Because it's not just about religion. Madeline?
Yeah, I'd like to say that the court being able to review the decisions the government makes in the middle of a pandemic is actually a really important check and balance. Yeah. I mean, of course, we wanted our government to respond when COVID came to our country and threatened to kill and threatened to maim and leave people with long COVID and cause all those worries. It was incredibly important our government responded, and they worked really hard at trying to protect New Zealanders and protect our way of life and find us a way forward. And their job is to, obviously they're trying to run the country. They've got to pass these laws that protect people, that it's uncharted waters. It's really difficult. And then they've got to satisfy everybody and balance all the rights and draw those lines in the right place. That's hard. So they pass those laws, and then it's for us, the people, to ask the questions. The media plays a role. They ask questions. The keyboard warriors on Facebook and on other social media platforms, the people writing letters to the editor, the people on the radios, we're all citizens. We all play a role, and our voices matter. So when we think, hey, hang on a minute, you've drawn this line in the wrong place, if enough people think that, then they're entitled to come to the court, and they're entitled to ask the court to look at where the lines have been drawn and to draw them. And I see it as a really constructive thing to do. If you've got a problem with the way a government has passed a law in a pandemic and you think it's been a bit rash, you could. I mean, we all saw, and I'm not trying to be critical of people's right to protest, but we saw a rather ugly protest happen down in Wellington that ended in a way that was just horrible. And it doesn't matter what you think of the rights and wrongs of that protest, the way it played out in the end was a horrible day for New Zealand. And but the passion and the feeling that the whole country had about that issue, I mean, there were people feeling really strong things, and we all felt strongly. We've all gone through the lockdowns, we've all gone through the hardships. We probably now all know people who've had COVID and people who've had it really bad. It's been a really difficult time, but a constructive way of asking those questions, of saying, hey, I don't think this was right, is to very respectfully put together a court case and go to the court and say, Your Honour, please look at this. I mean, I've got to say, the way that this hearing was conducted, the lawyers involved, the government ministers, everyone was incredibly respectful. It was a really polite and constructive experience. We were challenging ideas. We were each thinking the other was wrong, but it was done in a really sort of grown-up, mature. It was a nice way. It wasn't ugly, as I think. So I think law can be really good. I know we can often think that court cases and litigation is a really nasty, horrible thing, and it definitely can be. I mean, as a lawyer, I can I have no difficulty accepting that aspect of what I do. It's horrible, but this is a different type of litigation. Judicial review is part of it's a check and a balance. It's a way of politely, respectfully saying to the government, hey, I think you got this wrong, and asking the court to look at the lines and redraw them, and that's what was happening here. So it's not about anyone trying to squash anyone's rights. And again, just reiterating what we said at the outset, it was about the church saying, hey, we don't actually think that we were treated equally in the end. And there are a heap of examples that Graham and I were able to put to the government and actually just put this policy next to this policy. Like, for example, on the 15th of February 2022, the Ministry of Education issued a document that basically said if you're wearing a mask and you spend less than 2 hours in proximity with someone else, and you're close to them, like less than 1.5 meters away from them, so you're in close proximity to them, but you're wearing a mask, if it's less than 2 hours, you cannot become a close contact. If you don't live with that person, you cannot. So how could you walk into church on a Sunday at that same time and spend 60 minutes wearing a mask and come home with COVID? Well, you couldn't, because you could if you're in a school, you can't, but you can if you're in a church. And reiterating what Graham was saying before, 16, 17, 18-year-old students in schools did not have to be vaccinated. Their parents did not have to be vaccinated to come to parent-teacher interviews. Schools were able to hold assemblies. Schools were able to conduct singing, and teachers were expected to work in those environments from, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And once we were in February, we were dealing with Omicron. And as we know from the High Court's findings in Yardley, which was the police and defence's mandate case, the scientific consensus is that the vaccine does not significantly limit the transmission of Omicron. It did with Delta, it does not with Omicron. So the benefit of the vaccine became, once Omicron came along, protects you, stops you from getting horribly sick, it stops you landing in hospital, it stops you dying, stops you being a drain on the healthcare if you get it. And it's got all those good knock-on effects, but it doesn't stop transmission. And the whole point of a vaccine pass is about limiting transmission. So that vaccine pass stayed in place for the churches until the 4th of April. And yet we'd had months with only Omicron in the country where we knew that, the best weapon against transmission for Omicron was actually mask distancing, hand washing, staying home if you were sick. So we put all those arguments in front of the court. That's some of what the judges got to think about, and those sorts of policies that just seemed at odds. You think about what a plane looks like: hundreds of people, close proximity. You're all almost arms touching. You're rebreathing the same air. If you fly from Auckland to Dunedin or something like that, you spent longer in close proximity with those people than you would if you attended church or if you attended a prayer meeting in a mosque. And yet you could do that unvaccinated. You could, as long as you presented a test result, but you couldn't spend less time in a mosque. So again, that inconsistency. And of course, we know that people were using planes to go on holiday. So is going on holiday more important than the right to religion? I mean, the government says, of course, that you could get on a plane to access important medical appointments. But I put it to you that the majority of people on a plane flying between Auckland and Dunedin are not doing that for, essential appointments.
Awesome. All right, so we'll let's leave. Graham, if you could give us the last word and we'll finish off there. So anything that you might have to say to our audience or anything?
Please get vaccinated if you're not. But recognize that if you're a member of a church, that church will have you even if you're not, because God will. And so, this is an interesting type of case, and we hope we win because we think we've got good arguments for it. But if we don't, that sometimes happens too. But we're hopeful, I think. There are some good arguments in favor of our case, and so the right to religion isn't less important than any of the other rights. And in many respects, some of them you might say, if it's important to you, then it perhaps is one of the more important rights, given the role it can play in people's lives. And so we hope the government will recognise that. We hope the court will listen to the arguments and decide that, this is worth a second look. This is worth a close look. The right to religion, the right to practice your religion yourself and with others is important, and needs a really, really good reason if the government's going to limit. Just like all of the other rights we have, the reason they are rights is you have them unless there's a good reason for it. And so, it's important that when people can, if they feel that some right of theirs has been breached, there are ways like this to be able to stand up and say, government, listen to this court, hopefully tell you, this time you got it wrong. We're hopeful, and we're waiting for the decision just like everyone else.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome.
Oh, well, look, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for all of our people who've joined. Thank you so much for all of your agreements and disagreements, and absolutely wonderful all your comments in there. So God bless to all of you, whether you are jabbed, unjabbed, or otherwise. And we can't wait to hear back what's going to happen. In the meantime, God bless you. God bless every single one of your families, and God bless New Zealand. Ka kite.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.